report. And item 5, can I ask the committee to note the response from the Mayor to my letter in respect of London Assembly Brexit Directive 111. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, let's turn to the substantive business of the morning, which is discussed with invited guests on policing and other arrangements around the Tower Hamlets elections in May of this year, with the aim to give people from Tower Hamlets and London some comfort around that election in the context of the history there. So can I welcome our guests, which is Claire Bassett, of course, has been here before, Chief Executive Electoral Commission, Will Tuckley, old friend, colleague of mine, Chief Executive Tower Hamlets, welcome Will, Sue Williams, QPM, Borough Commander, and Stuart Wright, Met, Senior Enquiry Officer. I'm sure you'll describe your role in more detail. And I'd like to thank all the people out there who wrote to us and have done an immense amount of work around this. I'd like to particularly mention Councillor Peter Golds, who I find in the audience today, and thank him for all his work, and others including Andy Earlham and many others. And I think put it on record to thank those good people for all the work that they have done and are doing into focusing the minds of various organisations on this very real issue. So, turning to the questions in hand, so I will lead on the questions. First of all, Claire, if I may, to yourself, reflecting on the Pickles report, which was in response to allegations of electoral fraud back in 14, with a report issued and a review issued in 15, with many recommendations. So first of all, Claire, question to you. First of all, has there been any fresh legislation and guidance following on from the Pickles report that you implemented and understand?
So, thank you. I mean, first thing to say is that we very much welcomed the vast majority of what the Pickles report said. I think it really built on recommendations we had repeatedly made following previous elections and the really good work that the Law Commission did in 2016. The report was actually published in August of 2016. Yes. It's been, it has been out there now for a fair while. We received the government's response to it about a year ago. In fact, it was Boxing Day in 2016. And so it has been there. If I start with perhaps the things that have changed, in particular in respect of the Electoral Commission, there were a number of the recommendations that asked for changes to our guidance. We actually made those changes. Most of those changes had already been made by the time it came out, and any that were made in time for the 2017 May elections. So all of those changes were in place. That included changes to our guidance, which strongly encouraged returning officers to include additional guidance and postal packs about security, for example. We made changes to our polling station handbook, emphasising that English should be the predominant language within polling stations. And also we had done other things such as our partnership with Crime Stoppers and other work around awareness. So those are all the things that we were able to do just within the power of the Electoral Commission, so amending guidance and so forth. I think, disappointingly, frankly, there were a number of significant changes that were also recommended in the Pickles review that built on the Law Commission and other reports. Things that basically required changes to legislation and the law, and particularly primary legislation. We haven't seen any of those changes. We've had no primary legislation. So none of the changes like updating and strengthening electoral offences, changes to the process for challenging elections, for example, which there were a really high number of recommendations in the Pickles report for, and the creation of new offences. None of that has happened. Unfortunately, as is the case with an awful lot of primary legislation at the moment, although we think it's really important, it's come up against the bulk of the Brexit legislative demands on Parliament. And we are advised by Cabinet Office, who would be responsible for taking this forward, that it is not going to be possible in the near future to do any primary legislation, particularly while the Brexit changes are going through. So I think it is reasonable to assume that a lot of those primary legislative changes that we would all very much like to see are not going to happen in the near future. We are encouraging Cabinet Office wherever possible to keep the Law Commission's really good work progressing, so that at least when an opportunity for a bill were to arise, that might be well progressed and able to go forth. The Cabinet Office does recognise, however, I think, that this is an area that does urgently need reform, not just in the context we're talking today, but much more broadly. A lot of the changes around efficiency returning officers also need to change. And where possible, they are making changes through secondary legislation and orders. So an example of that is the voter ID pilots, where individual orders have been brought forward for all but one of those now in order to do those pilots. But again, more significant changes will take primary legislation. So a similar pilot where we piloted changes to the annual canvass in some local authorities last year and the year before. Those pilots were successful, but we've had to revert to the old way of doing things because there isn't ability to do primary legislation. So I think, to answer your question, we have made some changes and we would like to see more. Just to sort of follow through more specifically around the Tower Hamlets preparations, one of the other recommendations was around the preparation and how we work together in doing that. And I think we have increasingly seen that improve in all of the elections since 2014. We are attending all of the planning meetings with both the returning officer and the police there. And we have been closely involved in that and encouraging that, and pleased by a number of the changes that have been made, like count venues and that sort of thing.
So it's quite a mixed picture, in other words. So the measures that were recommended that you were able to do so without any kind of legislation, you have put in place. That's the point you're making.
Yeah.
And some that required secondary legislation, and we will get on to questions around this later, but voter ID is piloting, I should say, is in course and being put in place.
Well, just to sort of bring that forward, I think the problem we've got with secondary legislation, though, is that it isn't the panacea that it was perhaps hoped to be by some about a year ago, in that everyone else who's got primary legislation that can't through has also had the same good idea that they'll use secondary legislation.
Yes, of course.
So my understanding is that actually the pressure on time for secondary legislation is also extremely high now. And so just as an example, things like the manifesto commitment of votes for life, that's actually being taken through as a private member's bill.
So, so there's a logjam on secondary legislation for the reasons that you're saying. So there could be a wait for those as well that are required. So what kind of, so we can describe this to Londoners, what kind of proportion of Pickle's recommendations are now, only roughly, are now kind of in place?
Well, I would say that, I'm reluctant to put a number on it. I think that there were about, I would say about sort of 10-15% that related directly to us or to things like changes in guidance or recommendation. They've happened. I'd say that there's then quite a sort of grey patch of perhaps another 20-30% where some change is possible. So, for example, we can recommend people do things, and things like the campaigner code of conduct, which is a recommendation we would like to see that links to all of this, that's there, but it's only it's non-compulsory, and it would need legislation to be compulsory. So it's not a quite either or, because there are some things where it has been possible to make some progress, but not the whole progress that we would like to see.
You mentioned, and it's going to be covered again later, about English as the preferred language. I think some of our questions about it should be the language in the polling booth. You'll get asked around that later. But is that one that needs legislation, or one that you can just recommend for as good practice, as an example?
I need to double check. I know we have put it in our polling station handbook that English should be the language used in polling stations.
So someone, yes.
Whether that's if someone refused to do it and whether that's enforceable, I'm not quite. I'd need to check. We can write to you and let you know. Yeah. But certainly by one, I mean that's one of the ones where I think it's quite clear that it's in the polling station handbook for presiding officers, and they are instructed by returning officers to abide by the handbook. So
yeah, that's the point I'm making, that some of the Pickles recommendations that may need or do need legislation, you could put as recommendations.
yes, and that's what we've done.
So those that in the elections in May, they will be in the handbook saying it is preferred. Or we'll pursue this later.
So
this is preferred.
A really good example of where we've done that is the additional guidance that goes out with the postal packs. We have recommended that there is an additional guidance for voters in the postal pack about handling and security of their postal vote. The reason why I keep using the additional word is that it can't be in the main guidance because that's prescribed. But so that's a good example of a compromise where we are strongly recommending the additional bit. In an ideal world, it would be a requirement as part of the guidance.
And it's partly, I was going to say, about a hierarchy of preferences that you want to see when all of Pickles is implemented. Those ones that you see as the most important, you're trying to put as a recommendation in polling booths and in councils prior to any election, not just Tower Hamlets but elsewhere.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth saying at this point that one of the real challenges we face with elections and electoral law is how much of it is in primary statute, and it is hard to, so even sort of, you know, some forms that we would really like to change just for accessibility purposes are prescribed in primary legislation, so we can't change it. And one of the wider reforms we'd like to see is a recognition that actually you don't need quite so much of that prescription in primary legislation. You can have the overarching primary legislation, then below that have statutory instruments which give you greater flexibility and allow you to take out some of the real confusion and difficulty of having so many pieces of primary legislation.
Okay. So to recap, despite the frustration, shall we say, is that you've not been able to progress as quickly as possible, are you saying to us and to Londoners that you feel more reassured that some of the measures that you've been able to introduce and implement has given you more reassurance around May in Tower Hamlets?
Yes.
Okay, that's really good. Any questions on this section before I move to Peter? We'd like to take, we're now going to talk more specifically around Tower Hamlets itself. Peter, you've got some questions.
Can I start by asking Sue, could you just give us a picture of the general lessons that have been learned about the events surrounding the 2014 election?
Okay, so first of all, I welcome the opportunity to be here today to demonstrate that we have learned those lessons over since 2014. There's a lot of organisational learning that we've been putting into our plans for certainly in the elections that we've had in the last 2 years, so 2 general elections, referendum, the mayoral election for London and a by-election. We've been able to start putting those plans into process and refining them and learning from them as we've gone along, which will stand us in good stead for the election in May. Now, I know it's different, and everybody keeps telling me the election in May will be very different. So I'm always bearing that in mind. So first of all, I suppose, sorry, I've got something to I want to say that my main objective is to be as open and transparent about how we police these elections. So we were criticised quite severely from 2014 to 2015. And I want to make sure that, as far as I can for the police, that the public understand what we've put into place and how we're doing it. And I know we're going to talk later on about some of those methods. Part of my role is to support the returning officer in terms of our partnership plans, because it's very much a partnership between the police, the local authority and the Electoral Commission. I have a responsibility to ensure that my officers are well trained and that they're briefed, and I'll talk through some of that in a minute. And finally, what I think is really important is about improving the community confidence in policing, because I know that's had a hit. And whether it's because locally how we've investigated or centrally how we've investigated in the past, nevertheless it has an impact on the confidence in the community. So part of my openness and transparency is to increase that community confidence and also make sure that that organisational learning is fed into our plans. So when I look at what we gave training to our officers in 2014, 2015, it's very different, and today is very different to the training that we were able to provide. And I'll give you just a flavour of the sort of training that we've put in. All the officers on my borough So it's every single officer undergoing their performance development days throughout January to March is having this input in their training. So it's a 2-hour session with questions and answers, and it has been compiled based on previous learning, but also with assistance from local authority, the Electoral Commission, and we have had visitors come in during that training, like officers from Stuart's team have come in to talk about what officers need to do and be looking out for. So what we cover in that training is the history of the elections, with an in-depth view of what happened in 2014 and the subsequent removal of Luther Rahman from office, and the impact that that had. The understanding of what policing the election looked like, their roles, their responsibilities, up to the day and on the day itself, but also afterwards as well. So we need to ensure that it doesn't just stop after the polling stations close at 10, that we continue and the officers understand that even over the next few days and the count and even into the next week, we still monitor community tensions, and any allegations are encouraged, if there are allegations, that people still come forward and report them. The officers need to understand the pre-election purdah, what that means, because for a lot of the officers they don't understand it, but we also have a lot of directions that come out from our Directorate of Media and Comms, and that will come up nearer the time about officers' responsibilities. But we do that now so that officers have that awareness, and then the in-depth information will come out from our Directorate of Media and Comms later on. We tell the officers what to expect at the polling station, so we actually put in little pictures of, you know, what a polling station looks like, what it looks like on the outside, what it looks like on the inside, what the do's and don'ts are around policing, so what they're allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do as police officers. Also having an understanding of the sort of people that will come to a polling station. So obviously your voter, but you've also got candidates might turn up, or their agents might turn up, or there may be people on the outside canvassing, or people collecting the like the exit poll information, and where they can stand and where they can't stand. So we give them some sort of knowledge of what to expect at a polling station, so that they're alive to what is an offence and what isn't an offence under the RPA. We go through with them what electoral fraud and malpractice offences are and how to deal with them in advance as well as after the election and on the day. So it's important that they know how to advise people that come to them with an issue of how to report it, and the intelligence is really important to us, and also the social media, and I know we might talk about that later on, but identifying what press and social media is, what it might look like, how to deal with it before, and how to feed it into our intelligence processes. And also because we now have body-worn camera, which we didn't have last year, we give the officers instructions on how to use the body-worn camera outside the polling station as well as inside, and how that any incident they have, that they must put it on. So it's in standby mode, but then they put it on, so that we can record what is happening and sometimes what isn't happening. In other words, that, you know, just a general clip of what the officers are seeing on the day, so that we can put that into their statements. So at the end of their shift, they will all do a duty statement, which will be compiled, and we will have that as documentation. So there's quite a lot that goes into that training. Then on the day, all the officers will be briefed. So they will have a more in-depth briefing around maps, where the polling stations are, where the sectors are, the sergeants that are in charge of them, the inspectors that are in charge of them. They will get more information if we have intelligence about right-wing groups that we think might be coming to the borough and how to deal with them. And then, of course, we have a whole plan in place around how we manage not just the polling stations, but generally across the borough as a public order type situation, and how we would deal with that. And then on the day, you'll also have senior leaders that will be popping in and out of the polling stations and checking that people are doing what they should be doing and testing them. And at the the last general election last year, I was out and about, and I actually quizzed the officers as to, do you have your little card? They're given a card from the Electoral Commission about what all the offences are. They all pulled it out of their pockets so they could demonstrate they had it on them. And I was able to question them about their role there to make sure that they were doing what they should be doing. And we also invited out community representatives with us, so people like from the IAG, our independent advisory group, to come out. And they even came to our briefings in the morning. So we open ourselves up to the scrutiny of community representatives coming out to make sure that we are doing things as we say we're doing them.
Thank you. What you very comprehensively lay out there seems, though, to me to be basically statements of what officers should be doing anyway. Do you know what I mean? What their duties are at polling stations and what have you. I just wonder that a lot of the problems that arose during the election, and I'm thinking of May coming up, presumably were ones that were going on during a campaign, as it were. I mean, when you're talking about the general corruption, for want of a better word, the general corruption, it was actually something that happened before you got to the polling booth. I mean, do your officers have any training, therefore, in regard to that? I would have thought this is the crucial point.
Yes, of course. So that's included within their training, what happens before and canvassing and what happened with the postal votes last time, so that they're aware of it. So RPA offences are a small part of what the officers' learning is, and generally they're only made more aware of them as we come up to an election. It's not like the Theft Act or criminal damage or drugs, which they're dealing all the time, every day. So we have to remind them what those specific offences are and give them a bespoke training. And we do include the bit about canvassing before and postal votes and electoral fraud, but that's why we give them the history of what went on, and the consequences of not getting it right is that we have a full investigation team now, costing a huge amount of money, re-investigating those offences. So we want them to get it right very early on. So if they're coming across people that are saying something not quite right has happened, then they're able to point them in the right direction to get them to report it early on so that we can get an investigation underway. I've also invested in my faith officer, who in the last election, the general election, went round to all the different faith establishments and talked about spiritual influencing, talked about electoral fraud, and was able to give people a little bit more information about what is right and what is wrong, because a lot of the general public don't understand. And what we've said is we'll be happy to repeat that process with the faith officer leading up to this mayoral election as well.
So basically, you're talking about, say, what, a six-week period, where basically officers will be more aware of maybe...
They're aware from now. So they've had their training from January. The training started then. So the training goes from January to March, because we've got 14 training days, and we've got 600-700 officers, police staffers on top of that. We've got to incorporate everybody into that training. So it does take time. So the last of our officers will be trained in March, but our detectives have a bespoke training as well, because they're the ones that are going to be investigating, and they might have to realise the difference between what is an RPA offence and therefore put it up to Stuart's team, and what is a local offence that may be connected to an election, or it might involve a councillor or an MP or a candidate, and therefore that is specifically investigated by some dedicated officers that we put aside and given them additional training for.
My next question is, how many officers are we talking about? How many officers will be looking after this election?
On the day?
Well, actually for the period of the election.
Just so I get this right, are you talking about in the investigation, or are we talking about generally overall?
Campaign,
The whole thing.
So
every single one of my officers, so I have roughly, it does fluctuate, but it's roughly 620 police officers, and that includes some of our funded officers. Every single one of them will get that. Every PCSO will get that training. Every member of police staff, so front counter staff, will get that training. And we also highlight it with our intelligence staff, who are not my officers, the Met detention staff, who are not my officers, but who work at Tower Hamlets also get that training or get they get a briefing into that as well. To show you how serious I take this, on the actual day, I have dedicated that what I call a red day in terms of my resources, which means nobody gets that day off. The only people that can have that day off is if they've already submitted it within a period of annual leave. And we even check that so that it's not just something that they've put in because they want that day off, that there's a specific reason they've got a holiday, a wedding, something, family. Everybody is expected to be at work that day. We are going to use every single one of our staff during that poll, during the May the 3rd elections. But in the lead up to it, they're all trained and they will all have a role to play and they know what their role is.
Stuart, have you got anything to add to that?
Sorry?
Stuart, I'm just...
Oh, sorry.
Okay, I think
Thank you.
I get your concerns in terms of the run-up, and so from my view and my role, I've got sort of two hats, I suppose. The first hat is sort of corporate piece in terms of my team investigate all electoral malpractice fraud across London during the mayoral process this year. It's not just about Tower Hamlets, it's everybody. But obviously for today, it is what additionally have we done around Tower Hamlets in that respect. So some of the stuff you're talking about in terms of preparation and recognising the risks before we even hit that sort of 6-week period have already started. So one of the things we're looking at is in terms of social media, we're just working out the parameters of what a social media scan would be around keywords, key sites, in terms of trying to capture some of the information in terms of...
Can I ask you, I know you can't give me the actual words or whatever, but what are you actually looking for, therefore, on social media? What specific...
So looking back from the previous experiences in terms of the historical piece, in terms of
we're covering that, Peter, we're covering that. We've got some question on that later, so if you don't mind, we could hold that thought, possibly.
Okay, well, I'll just finish off. I've just got one more in that case. Sorry about that. We'll speak about that later. What's your general... I'll ask the whole panel, actually. What's your general, if you like, level of confidence in what we can expect in May this year? Are you quite confident that a fair, thorough election is going to be delivered this time?
Definitely from policing, that is our intention, to provide a fair, open, transparent election. That's what our intention would be. And that's what we're working towards. So we use the lessons learned all the time, and including the 5 elections that we've had in the last couple of years, to build on that so that we make sure that it is independent and fair as it possibly can be. We know that there could be issues because we understand the history, and it's about learning the history enables you to plan for the future.
So I very much echo that thought. Obviously, as the returning officer, conducting a fair and appropriate election is an absolute core concern for me. I have to do everything I can to ensure that that's the case. And I think particularly, as the committee have emphasised, learning from the past is absolutely vital in that context. Of course, Tower Hamlets is a constantly changing place. We have the fastest growing population in the country. We have huge churn in that population. So there are no grounds whatsoever for any degree of complacency in terms of how deeply embedded understanding of the electoral process and what is right and what is wrong is. So Sue is right, we're going to be challenged. We've already been challenged in the lead up to this election. And that's going to be constant all the way through. So do I expect it to be entirely smooth and without incident? No, I don't. The issue is, are our plans appropriate and adequate to be able to cope with events? And that's what we've been testing on each of the elections, certainly that I've been responsible for in Tower Hamlets. But I think I and colleagues appreciate that the mayoral and local elections are of a different intensity, perhaps, than some of the other elections that we've experienced in the borough.
One more question to finish. How big is your electorate, actually?
So we have the current register is just over 190,000.
190?
Yeah, which is the highest it's been in recent times, so it is a considerable electorate. So the borough's just topped 300,000 people. It's not quite as large as Croydon or one or two other boroughs, but it's growing. It's growing. Barnet, yes, it's growing rapidly. So it's a serious and significant electorate.
Very much.
We'll be exploring the measures that the council are going to put in place a little bit later. Unmesh, you wanted to ask some questions?
Yes, Chair, if I may. A couple of questions of you, sir. I'm glad you talked about body-worn video cameras. I was going to ask you that later on, but I might as well raise it now. So I welcome what you said about the use of body-worn videos both inside and outside polling stations. And I think so far the rollout all over London has been a success, from what I gather. Do you envisage any problems with using the cameras inside the polling stations? I mean, I don't, but I just got to put this to you formally.
So we've given the officers some guidance on that. So clearly, if they're going in to use the facilities, like to go to the toilet or make a cup of tea or something like that, they wouldn't put it on. But if they're called by the presiding officer in there that there's a problem, we're asking them to go in with it on standby and then hit the button if they think there's something happening that they need to record. What we don't want them to record is individuals that are in there casting their vote, because there's obviously a secrecy around that and they shouldn't be filmed. But
Absolutely.
Just so that people understand, when something's in standby, it rotates, I think it's about 10 seconds, but it's on a loop, it just rotates. So it's not recording, it only records if the officer presses it and holds it down. So if it's on standby, that's nothing to worry about, because it will just be on a loop and it will keep wiping itself out. But we've given them the guidance of that, if they think something's happening, then use it, because they might have to, it might be used as evidence, they may have to record it. And outside as well, if there are issues or problems, they should always have it on standby and then press record if they see something of note.
Will you be receiving extra resources compared to other boroughs? Do you think you'll need more officers?
Are we using?
Will you need more help from outside the borough?
From off the borough?
Yeah.
So there's a couple of cases where we think we will need some assistance from the outside the borough, just for roving patrols. So for instance, if Britain First turned up, we may need some support from outside the borough to deal with that, because our officers are in and around polling stations, and some of them have got specific responsibilities for that day. So we have asked for it to be put into the Golds plan for public order for the whole of London, to consider some additional resources. And because the count will be on Newham, there will be officers from Newham policing outside the count there. And they will all be briefed. So what we've said is, if we use any officers that are not Tower Hamlets, they will get a briefing.
Certainly using Excel is 100 times better than the Troxy, which I mean,
Yes.
I don't know if your colleagues have been inside the Troxy, but to hold the 2014 election count there, in what is really a very small arena, with all the inevitable pressures on staff. But anyway, that's all water under the bridge, as they say. Will, can I ask you a couple of questions? In some boroughs, they have codes of conduct between the various parties. Now, I know these codes are not enforceable, and we know seriously some parties, not represented from in this chamber, take codes of conduct. Do you envisage doing something like that in Tower Hamlets? And sadly, I do have to agree with you. I don't think things will run that smoothly.
So I do.
Yeah.
There was, though, a protocol in 2014. As I understand it. I obviously wasn't there in 2014, but there was a protocol that was discussed with and circulated to the political parties taking part in the election in 2014. Clearly, as I understand it, some parties agreed to sign up to that, some didn't. And of course, as we know, afterwards, practice didn't perhaps match up to the assumptions that were set out in the protocol. Nevertheless, clearly political parties are a core part of our democracy, a core part of the process around the elections, have a very significant role to play, and I would hope that they would agree a protocol, and having reviewed recently the content of the previous protocol, I thought it was broadly directed in the right areas. The issue is compliance.
But I think just going through the process, in my opinion,
Yes.
certainly helps. The other thing I want to ask is, the issue is really about public confidence in, and then restoring faith in democratic processes. So are you planning any sort of publicity campaign around do's and don'ts?
Yes, we are.
To the various council outlets?
I think, as I said earlier, particularly in a borough with quite a high population turnover, it's really, really important that people understand the process that we're going into in terms of the mayoral and local elections. We want that to have maximum impact, so we're timing it to coincide with the work that's been done by the Electoral Commission and the Cabinet Office at a national level. And my understanding is that kicks off in a bigger way later this month and then leads through into March. But I'm sure Claire and others can say more about that. But certainly the idea is that will up the amount of information and communication and engagement then running through towards the election.
There will be questions later on postal votes, but I'm thinking more, especially to the BME media and the many television channels that cover Tower Hamlets, the satellite television channels, particularly issues about handling of postal votes and other problems that have arisen in the past. It's about getting that message over. And lastly, can I ask you about what I think is called treating the very many parties and receptions that are held in the run-up to the election period, and some of the costs of these events are never find their way to election returns. I mean, what are you doing about monitoring all these events?
In terms of all the election offences, clearly are being monitored quite carefully in terms of the of allegations and other issues that are made. Yeah. I think, as Sue indicated, raising the awareness about those offences, and clearly many of them were featured in the conduct of the electoral court. So it's a vital part of our communication and information to make it clear, both to the general electorate but also to political parties, what is acceptable and what isn't. And treating it clearly is something which I think is not as well understood as it might be. But of course there have been one or two notable occasions nationally and indeed in Tower Hamlets where that has been a key allegation and a key part of conduct that has been undertaken. So we are certainly reacting to any allegations we get in relation to treating, being very clear about what the law is. And the law is very absolute in relation to it.
Yeah, I think I've strayed into other colleagues'
that's fine.
questioning, so I'll stop at that.
Indeed, that takes us nicely into the next set of questions, which we'll be talking about, particularly how you'll be dealing with malpractice and other offences. My only comment really is I understand that Commander David Musker is the gold of the operation, which for the record gives me certainly some reassurance. Now, Andrew, you've got some questions.
Before I go on to my question, can you ask Sue, you talked about the training that officers in Tower Hamlets are getting. What about the rest of the Met? Are they getting any training on this as well? Because obviously Tower Hamlets is something of a special case, but it's not necessarily alone. And electoral problems are growing, I think, more generally. Are the rest of Met officers getting training on this?
So they won't have the same level of training as us. The Met will put out briefing notes, communications to all officers about what to expect in an election time, what the officer's role is. So similar to what we're doing, but it will be in a different format. Some boroughs may choose to include it on their professional development days like we have. I don't know what the other boroughs are doing. Certainly because there's going to be a big operation across London, all the people involved in that operation will have a briefing. So every single officer that will be involved in the run-up to the election and their duties on the day and at the camp will get a bespoke briefing as to what their role is. But I can't hand on heart say that the rest of the Met is getting what we're giving. I think we've had to look at ours as a specific case as Tower Hamlets. It is pretty unique, and therefore we need to make sure that our officers on Tower Hamlets are well trained, understand what's gone on in the past, understand the implications and understand their role going forward.
I think to give you some reassurance, my role is to ensure that the training for staff across London is in place in terms of the officers. So the product that Tower Hamlets produce in terms of the training that they give to the police officers, we will be sanitising, obviously taking out the local issues and that was sort of thing. And the headlines will be sent out to all the staff going into the mayoral elections. And then, as Mark Williams said, part of that will be briefings as we get closer. But obviously my role within that is actually scanning as well, not just Tower Hamlets, but generally across London, if there's any themes developing around any electoral malpractice, because it may well be, it won't just be Tower Hamlets this time, it may be another area which starts having issues, and it'd be my role within my team to manage that with the local borough, whichever area that will be.
Right, Claire, I'd like to talk about registration of political parties. So just running through quickly the history. You withdrew the recognition of the original Borough political party, Tower Hamlets first. And then in January last year, you refused to recognise a new party called Tower Hamlets Together. And I think that was because it had a name similar to a local charity working in the health sector. Is that right?
Well, I think it was actually a partnership between health and social providers. I mean, it was quite a significant, well-known organisation across Tower Hamlets. But yes, and it's about registration rather than recognition. Just
registration, fine. Yeah. And then the symbol of the new part of that party, which you disallowed, was a house, same as it had been for Tower Hamlets first.
Yeah, because I mean, perhaps. Would you like me to sort of answer the...
Well, I'll take it through. Now, obviously, I'm now heading towards Aspire, which you have accepted. And I was wondering what the logic behind accepting that was. Bearing in mind that its logo is exactly the same as the one you wouldn't register last year and exactly the same as the one that Tower Hamlets first had. Exactly the same. And what I'm concerned about in relation to Aspire is that name is both the name of a national charity and also a local charity working out of Toynbee Hall. So what I'm concerned about is what's the difference between Aspire and in fact there's quite a number of businesses called Aspire as well operating in the area. As a simple Google search as I did this morning showed. What's the difference between registering Aspire and not registering Tower Hamlets Together?
So, just to take it a step back, there's a clear statutory test that we apply for the registration of parties, and that is around the party that wishes to be registered, providing us with particular information, names, descriptions, emblems, and then financial schemes and details of statutory office holders within that. That is the only test we have. So we have to apply that against the rules that are there. In terms of Tower Hamlets Together, our research showed very clearly that was a very well-known, established, understood name across Tower Hamlets. We did the same test for Aspire and didn't come to the same conclusion and applied the rules as they were there, which resulted in the registration of that party. I think I would just say that to make the point that if a party isn't registered, we can't take any enforcement action against it. And this is a process where we robustly apply the rules that we can in testing it, particularly around making sure that we know who the office holders are and that they have a constitution and the financial schemes that are necessary. But essentially, if those are in place and that is there and that we deem the name unlikely to confuse or cause offence. So it isn't enough that it's just a name that is used elsewhere. There are plenty of parties where their names are used elsewhere. It's about whether we deem that likely to cause confusion or offence. And that's the test set out in the statute.
Well, I understand it's the same people as involved as was in the one that you wouldn't register. But you said you did some research locally on the net. What research did you do? What did it consist of?
So it went through our standard due diligence process, which is looking to see whether there are other names and taking on board. I mean, I'd like to make clear, we had no representations from anyone and we published the fact that we've received a registration and we did that, and we did not have registrations about that one in terms of that name being the same as others as we were processing it.
Well, I see Councillor Gold in the audience looking at that answer with some incredulity. So I assume
he had objections to us registering it on the grounds that people believed that it was similar to a previous party. And as I said, we have to apply the rules that are given to us. And that someone who is banned might be associated with that party is not within that test as a reason for us not to register that party. And it's our firm belief that if we hadn't registered the party as it complied with those rules, then that would have been a wrong decision that would have been subject to challenge.
But I'm just going back to the question that set that off, which is the research and your due diligence process. What does that research actually consist of? I mean, as I said, I did a Google search this morning and found loads of organisations called Aspire, both national and local, operating in Tower Hamlets. So, you know, if it's a question of
it's
common
about
parlance passing off, I think
so it's about then applying the test of whether it was likely to cause confusion to the voter, that they may think that that party is something that it isn't, and we look at that and we make the decision in that circumstance that we didn't think it was likely to cause confusion to the voter.
Fine, that's your conclusion. I'm asking what the process is that leads to that conclusion. I mean, I said I did a Google search, but you said you did some research locally as well. I just wonder what that research locally is.
I'm afraid I don't know in detail what it would have. I strongly suspect it would have included a Google search which would have looked at what those parties were, and general research on social media to see what profiles they had, what companies and organisations were open and active. I'm afraid I can write to you afterwards the details of exactly what was done. I'm afraid I don't know.
Yeah, because in relation to the one that you, going back to your earlier answer, in relation to the one that you didn't allow, the Tower Hamlets together, you said you did some research locally, which I assume...
No, what I'm saying is that it was very clear. Yeah, so that research throwed up a very established, well-known local partnership of established public and voluntary sector providers, I think, and that was a much stronger argument for us to believe that it could cause confusion to the voter.
But how do you know that was more well-known than, say, Aspire at Toynbee Hoyle, or Aspire of any of the businesses that have that name in Tower Hamlets, or in the Aspire National?
It's not just about whether it's well known, it's about applying that judgment of whether it's likely to confuse the voter. And that's the judgment we apply in every bit of the registration process. And at the end of the day, if someone wants to register a party, you know, we have to apply the standard test that is provided to us. And I'm just asking what the mechanism for doing that is. Well, I'm trying to explain it to you. I'm not sure what it is you're trying to establish. I didn't you'd like to have done.
Well, what I'm getting at is, why did you conclude in relation to, without actually doing any research on the ground, which doesn't seem like you did other than on the internet, why, in relation to Tower Hamlets together, did you conclude that it was a local name that was well known and reject it on that grounds for causing conclusion? And why you didn't come to the same conclusion in relation to Aspire, bearing in mind that it's both a national charity, which is well known, a local charity working out of Toynbee Hall, which is well known, and the name for a load of local businesses operating in the area.
Because
what's the difference?
So when we look at those, when we looked at Tower Hamlets, that has a higher profile in our, and we felt that was more likely to confuse the voter.
How do you decide it had a high profile?
Well, in the analysis that we did and looked at, I'm really sorry, I do not have in front of me a detailed breakdown. We do hundreds of registration checks. I do not have a breakdown here of every piece of work we did that looked at. I'm very happy for us to write to you afterwards, but I don't think... I mean, at the end of the day, we are applying a statutory test. And ultimately, you know, that test limits us to, would it confuse the voter? The fact that there are multiple Aspires actually is different from there being one significant Tower Hamlets.
I think we pursued it. If I could just say, please do write to us with more of an analysis of how you arrived at that decision. It would appear to me that the judgment that you arrived at the end of that decision is one that differs from particularly Andrew and others here. So I think we let that rest, and then Andrew continue with your thoughts.
Well, the next question on registration is, has Tower Hamlets Political Independent Group applied to be a political party?
Before you do that, something that I'm confused by. You have told us that the test is likely to confuse. Is that right?
It's caused confusion, and I've got the exact wording if you'd like me to read it from the statute here for you.
But the gist of it is that, that it's likely to confuse. Now, you've only spoken about the name, you haven't spoken about the emblem. Now, this is an electorate where it is likely that the emblem is going to be far more recognisable than the name. Therefore, did you not think that the emblem of this group Aspire being identical to the emblem which was used by the previous organisation, Mr. Rahman's organisation, is much more likely to confuse the electorate, in as much as they are going to identify the emblem which was used last time with the emblem which they are proposing to use this time?
I appreciate the impact of that, and I think that what we have to do is apply the law as it is there, and actually that isn't confusion. And I think that we had to apply it as it was, and parties are allowed to use emblems which are no longer in use. So, I mean, we have applied that as it is there.
Forgive me, but it's when you say it is no longer in use, but this is something which is being resuscitated. Really,
yes, but it's not on the electorate, it's not on our register of emblems then, as to that side of it. And you know, this is an area of the law we have repeatedly asked to be clarified and made stronger. And I'm what I'm trying to do is explain to you how we have applied the limited test that we have to whether a party can be registered. And at the end of the day, as it stands, we could have just had this repeated process until there was a name that wasn't on there, and that would have happened. And I think, I just go back to the point I made earlier, that at least if a party is registered, then we can monitor it and we can take enforcement action against it.
I do understand that, but Tower Hamlets is certainly unique in London, even if it's not unique in the country, inasmuch as a very high proportion of the electorate is much more likely to be able to recognise a sign than to be able to read a description.
And that's why we have the rules that we do on emblems.
I think I'll bring you in straight back. It's a very fair point, because when you're weighing up your judgment call, shall we say, around this, that should, I'd have thought, been factored in, that many people with English as their second or third language, that their prime identification will be the sign and the picture of something that is exactly the same as the previous grouping. And while you're making this judgment call, I would have thought, or people out there would have thought, that would have factored quite strongly in. Anyway, Andrew, continue with your thoughts.
Well, I'm just following that theme. The emblem of Aspire is exactly the same as the emblem of the party whose recognition you withdrew, correct?
Yes, but we withdrew that on the confusion of the
answer is yes, right. So, no, not the Tower Hamlets first one, the one you actually withdrew from, not the one you wouldn't register. The original Rahman party, which you withdrew recognition from. Now, following the points made by Tony and indeed the chair, how would voters know that it wasn't exactly the same party if they're going by the emblem? If the emblem is exactly the same of a party that you've said is no longer lawful and you've withdrawn recognition from, and that emblem exactly the same appears against the name of another party, as far as half the electorate is concerned, they'll think it's exactly the same party.
Exactly. I appreciate that point. I think that the issues of emblems and how is something that we are being challenged in the courts on at the moment, and is something that we can review separately. Rather than prolonging this, I'm very happy to take that away, and when we write back to the committee, write back about whether we can review whether there is anything else we can do on that issue. Our hands are tied by the limitations of the law, but I am very happy to undertake to go and have another look at that and see whether there is anything else that we can do.
I think that would be careful, because if the point is not to confuse the electorate, the electorate are going to be pretty confused if they see the same emblem for a new party that was exactly the same as the one you've...
I think the reason why I'm being a bit vague is I'm not quite sure to what extent the test extends to emblems around whether that's just offence, and I think we just need to check that. And I will write back and understand that, and we will undertake to review that again.
You may like to go back to that kind of drawing board, because whilst you've given the permission, you may now have if you look
Well,
at
emblems are different to the name,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
your party can be registered and they can have a number of emblems, and we
no,
can.
let me just
challenge
continue.
that.
That's my
Yeah.
point. You permitted the party, but perhaps you could do some more work on the emblem,
Yeah.
where you could actually perhaps not permit the emblem to be used on literature for the reasons that we've just talked about, and do some work on that if you could.
I'm very happy for us to review
and then
that
write
and
back
have a
to
look
us.
at that.
Andrew.
Okay, well,
No, please, still on this precise point. Given the immediacy of this thing is happening within days,
We will do it straight away.
The election, reviewing it is clearly not going to stop what's going to happen because of the inevitable delay. Are you telling us absolutely that there is nothing the Electoral Commission can do to prevent a group from using exactly the same emblem of a group which it's difficult. It's difficult to phrase. A group which does not command the respect.
That's what I'm agreeing to take away and have another challenge of and have a look at.
So you believe it could be stopped?
I don't know.
Before May.
I think we can act if it can be. We can act very quickly. I'm afraid sitting here before you as the chief exec, not as the detailed lawyer that is responsible for this area of our work, I'm wary of committing either way to that because I just don't know the answer, I'm afraid.
Did you not think that such a question might come up today?
I did, and I'm slightly frustrated that I don't have the answer here, and I'm sorry.
If you could commit to go away and look at that with some urgency.
It's not going to happen.
Right, Peter, look, Andrew's signalled. I like people to signal if they want to speak. Right, Andrew, please.
Right. Well, I mean, I think we've thrashed that through, and I think you get the impression that none of us are particularly impressed by the outcome. So
no, I appreciate that.
I think that's fair to say.
Yes. Can I go on to the police, please? And can you give us an update on the number and types of allegations of electoral malpractice you've had so far, or fraud, in the run-up to the election, and what investigations you're currently pursuing?
For this year?
Yeah.
So we've had 18 allegations so far this year. It does
18, yeah.
18, and it does feed into, to a certain extent, the code of conduct that was discussed earlier. So far of those 18, 15 are comments made between councillors or candidates, in mostly false representation. But reality is, looking through those crimes, which is my role, how many of those will actually lead to any convictions at the end? Only 2 of those have gone up to CPS at the moment for early investigation advice. And there is a degree of code of conduct issue around some of those, in terms of if the code of conduct was statutory and enforceable, I think a lot of those issues that have already occurred would not have occurred in the first place. Because a lot of the comments are being alleged, which have occurred previously over the last couple of years, where comments have been made between people over a period of time, and suddenly we go into this election piece, and suddenly it becomes false representation, rather than it's a continuation of behaviour that's been going on between people for a period of time. I think we've got to be careful about how that looks going forward.
2 questions that come out of that answer, if I may, Stuart. First of all, what are the 2 cases? I'm obviously not the detail, but what are the allegations in the 2 cases you have referred to CPS? What sort of cases are they?
Both of those are the majority is social media in terms of false representations, and 2 of those are comments made on social media, which our first view is that they do overstep the mark in that respect.
Okay. And then on the code of conduct, as you said, it's not statutory. But does it have any evidential force? I mean, certainly if you look in civil law, codes of conduct can have significant evidential value. Does the code of conduct, even though it's not statutory, have evidential value to you and the CPS in the way they approach analysing these offences, alleged offences?
Considering most of them are under false representation, you've got to show that there's an intent to influence and affect that person's potential within that electoral process.
But more
and so the code of conduct doesn't really deal with that in terms of the intent.
But more generally, in relation to the code of conduct and other electoral offences, does it have evidential value?
Not from the Crown Prosecution Service view at all, because I had a meeting with them a couple of weeks ago, and that was one of the things we discussed. There is no, within law, it's not added as a positive or a negative in that respect, so even if they've had that briefing.
So it doesn't carry any evidential value at all?
I think it will depend on what, and it is a case-by-case situation, but we can't do a blanket, it will cover everything. I think if the individual has been through the electoral process a number of times before and has had that code of conduct message given to them over a number of period of time, you could probably use that as a positive. I think considering if it's a new person who's going into the electoral process, I don't know whether the code of conduct would actually have any weight at all.
I mean, choose a comparator. The highway code has evidential value in deciding whether you've been a careless driver or not, doesn't it?
It does, yes.
Right. And so I'm just trying to see the same impact in relation to these codes. They don't have any evidential value other than what you just outlined.
It's only because you've got to show intent. So it's for the Crown Prosecution Service, their view is the code of conduct doesn't take it any further in terms of intent.
Okay. And have you... One of the areas that the Electoral Court criticised and found in favour of the petitioners for was payment of canvassers. Are you getting any intelligence of this going on at the moment?
Not at the moment. So this forms part of our intelligence scanning that we are moving into, and it picks on a point that Mr Whittle made earlier in terms of how do we know what the risks are going into it rather than just the 6 weeks before. So part of the media scanning is going to be around, are we identifying any issues around that as we go forward? And it's also about the lessons learned in 2014 in terms of how do we put that into that scanning.
Okay, and then coming on to treating and intimidation, we've already talked about treating, and the interesting thing about treating, if I may digress briefly, is that William Wilberforce spent the equivalent of £600,000 on his election 200 years ago for one constituency. So there's nothing new about treating, because and he only had about 200 voters at the time as well. So, you know, there's nothing new about treating, but it wasn't illegal in those days. It is now, and you've got no evidence of treating at the moment.
This stage, but as I said, as that media scanning and that scanning the offences start coming in, that may well change.
Or intimidation of voters?
Yes, nothing like that at the moment. We've got information about door knocking on a couple of occasions, but part of the lessons learnt from 2014 is we're working with Tower Hamlets around those locations, whether it's multi-occupancy areas, streets where there had been a number of offences previously. We were going to those a little bit more frequently than maybe we did previously, just to see if we can stop that sort of offending occurring, because part of the issue is about prevention rather than just the prosecution.
Okay, and can I go on to social media now? And you've mentioned you're looking at social media. How exactly are you monitoring social media? I don't know if it's Sue or Stuart.
So from my side, I can't go into detail about how it's going to be delivered in that respect. So as I said earlier, there will be a sort of package of words, key sites, key locations to start off with. Factor that, what will be factored into that as we go forward will be the councillor getting a web page up for community issues to be forwarded into the council, and we'll be meeting with them on a regular basis to capture that intelligence to see if that takes us into different areas in that respect. And as a combination of that, all that information, that's how we will work out where the issues are occurring. But I can't go into too much detail about what it looks like or what the information is, because we're still going through it ourselves in terms of what the key words are going to be in the key sites. But that will expand as the intelligence comes in.
So I was just going to say, locally, we have our own local intelligence team who are starting to monitor social media. We have the assistance of some Bangladesh officers on the borough who will look at some of the websites and kind of do some scan monitoring. They will do more in-depth as we get closer to the election and on election day. But if there is any intelligence, they will bring it to our information so we can recycle it into the system.
And the sort of thing, what sort of, I mean, I think this is a fair question, despite what you said. The sort of things you're looking for are defamation, intimidation. What the sort of things that you rather than use the exact words, what sort of offences are you monitoring social media for?
Be like malicious communication. So if somebody is using inappropriate language, like which could constitute a hate crime, like Islamophobic or anti-Semitism, then obviously we would pick those up. And sometimes people come to us and say there have been people making comments on social media, so we would go back and review that, and if there's offences there, then we record it or we put it in as intelligence.
What about at the moment? Councillor Gold has sent us some examples of the smearing of I presume, one of his councillor colleagues, who's been described as Islamophobic, and he sent us copies, screenshots of the material, which does look to me, prima facie at least, intimidatory, defamatory for sure. And I presume you've seen these as well. And the author of them is identified. So it shouldn't be too hard to track him down. And what he says is that the initial police response was to say that basically give them a phone call and have a word with them. Is that it?
No, totally incorrect. I had a conversation with Councillor Gold before this meeting actually around that information. And there is a bit of disingenuity around it in terms of, without going into the depths of the investigation, that has actually gone to CPS for early investigation advice. The individual concerned who received that information didn't want to make a statement to us at all, and actually just gave us it for information rather than as a criminal offence. But considering the learning that happened from 2014, any information or allegations that we receive will always get a crime report now in that respect. So we took it off our own back to actually put that through CPS, so that's going through early advice. So the suspect hasn't been spoken to yet because we're getting CPS advice first in terms of is it in the period where they're a candidate in the first place? Because that's a very grey rule at the moment in terms of the Crown Prosecution Service. When does that kick in that respect? So that's one of the issues that I've got to consider. I think, as you've seen yourself from the tweet, it's very clear the message that's in there. But what do we do off that? So there are a number of options that will occur off the back of that. Worst case scenario from our point of view is if the Crown Prosecution decide it's not a criminal offence, that person will be visited and spoken to and probably be given words of advice and a letter of warning to start off with if the CPS decide it's not a criminal, doesn't reach a criminal level. So in terms of the phone call, that was never ever suggested. Everybody will get, in terms of suspects, will be physically visited as we go through this process, because that's part of our commitment.
Presumably from your answer, then there may be things which are not a criminal offence when somebody's not a candidate as far as the CPS is concerned, but exactly the same thing could be an offence once they are satisfied, the CPS, that they are a candidate.
Because of that, and it comes back to that electoral, it's so archaic.
Is that a fair analysis?
Yes, and it depends where the CPS decide where does the candidate piece kick in.
Yeah, it used to be a lot easier in the old days.
It did, yes, unfortunately. Or fortunately, is the case.
Okay. And the last question I want to put to you is about the detective inspector who was involved in the 2014 issues. Is she involved in the current supervision of the elections and potential offences?
I think a bit of clarity, she was never involved in the 2014 offences. She wasn't in the team then. She didn't come into the team until 2015, so she was never part of the original investigations in that respect. She picked it up as it went on. She's still a member of my team, and I'm more than happy because when I took it over in November, I reviewed all the team and all the skills. They've all had enhanced training with the City of London, which has been supported by the Electoral Commission in terms of the first national electoral programme, and they're at the National Board in February, so I'm more than satisfied that the staff in there have got the skills. And at the end of the day, one of the reasons I've been brought in is the final decision making stops with me. So it's not just the detective inspector, there's sergeants in there that have been in there since 2015. At the end of the day, I've got oversight, and it's at the end of the day, the buck stops with me.
Okay. I think there's some reassurance around that. Unmesh, I think you signalled.
Sorry, just 2 points, Chair.
I
think, Stuart, you said someone hadn't made a statement. Can you just clarify that point? You said someone hadn't made a statement. This is in relation to...
So the original information regarding that social media message, the person who provided this information hadn't given us a statement.
The person was on the receiving end of the...
Yes.
Is that Mr...
Well, you better not say who it is.
Yeah.
don't say it.
And it had been provided to us as information only, which is fair enough, but because of the learning from 2014, part of it's about those themes, emerging issues, risks, etc. We will still take that as a crime and take that forward, even if the person doesn't want to make a statement, because there may well be direct, clear evidence that an offence has occurred, and it becomes a victimless prosecution to a certain extent.
And even if it's not an offence now, it might be later.
Yes.
Okay.
And sorry, just one more, Chair. I just want to get my head around this. So the issue of when is someone a candidate and when is someone not. Now, this person, and we got a screenshot of the tweet sent out, has been openly campaigning in that part of Tower Hamlets as a candidate, has been identified in the media, has been speaking at various events, has now switched parties actually, from what I gather, in the last few days. So, I mean, for all practical purposes, she is a candidate. So I just can't get my head around this. When is someone a candidate and when someone...
We've had a long conversation with the Crown Prosecution.
I know nomination papers are going to be served and so on.
I appreciate that. But
that hasn't happened yet.
But from the evidential side, the law itself, as far as Crown Prosecution Service is concerned, it's not specific enough around what is a candidate and what's not. It's a very broad interpretation. So, for example, the individuals you're talking about at the moment, from my point of view, they're candidates because people have known that they're going to be candidates in this year's election for a period of time before now. But that doesn't mean that, as part of the issue is, if you look at the crimes that have been alleged so far, a lot of the people that are being alleged against at the moment haven't formally said they're candidates at this stage. There's no...
That won't happen until the papers are filed.
And I think that, for the Crown Prosecution Service, that's where the confusion sits at the moment, is under the law, which ones are we going to target in terms of they're candidates or they're not. And that's part of the confusion for them. And for me, it's more about what's the comments that are being made, because it may well be a hate crime rather than electoral crime. And I think that's one of the lessons, again, learnt. We're not just focusing on just the electoral offences, it's the wider piece around have any criminal offences been occurred, not just the electoral pieces. So is there a hate crime there? Because, you know, it's quite direct, some of that conversation that's been put on the media. So it's that wider piece as well. So I don't want to get hung up in candidates, because it is, I had an hour with the CPS and I was confused when I walked out. So it is not an easy parameter to set in terms of candidates. But all I would say is they're taking the view as a candidate with the widest brush.
See, I'll just finish on this point, Chair. I appreciate your hands are tied and you've got to go to the CPS, but speed is of the essence. See, what the impression out there is, suddenly these people think they got a license to say what they want and can get away with it, and it's getting that message across that, you cannot do this, you're breaching, this legislation of that law.
No, I agree with you completely in that respect.
And that's the problem we have in Tower Hamlets and possibly some other parts of East London, that people think that they can operate freely without any, with the complete freedom to see what they want.
But that's why within that situation, although we weren't clear whether they were a candidate, we've still put it up to CPS for early evidence or early investigation advice. And as I said, if that doesn't come back in terms of there's a criminal offence occurred because they're not seen as a candidate, we will still be going physically to speak to the individual concerned, still be giving a warning and putting that message out that that's been done.
Because
getting that message out that is important.
Because it may become an offence.
Tony, did you want to come
just
in?
last question.
Andrew, please.
This short question. Has the CPS said they're going to prioritise getting on with these? Has the CPS said they're going to prioritise getting on with giving you an answer? Or is it going to go hanging on for months like it often is with the CPS? Because this is the sort of thing where we actually need a very prompt decision from the CPS.
That's the point I was getting at, Chair.
I get that. It's one person, the CPS, in terms of who deals with these investigations. It's part of their day job. It's not their day job, as the case may be, because they're also counter-terrorism, so their workload is high. So although they will prioritise as best as they can, we can't set a timescale with them where they will deliver within a set number of weeks. We've made it quite clear in terms of community confidence especially, we need a fast answer so we can get that message out. And all we can do is just keep badgering them, I suppose, is best description, to get that answer.
It's usually it comes in June, is it?
No, I can definitely say...
Or on May the 4th.
We got that. Tony?
Yes. In a way, it's related to the necessity for action to be taken before the events of May, and I'm afraid you've kind of compounded it, Mr. Ryan, by talking about, well, this isn't their day job and they've got terrorism. And we heard earlier from Ms. Bassett about Brexit stopping legislation. You know, these are the kind of things that we hear all the time, why things can't be done. I want to address this question to ask Mr. Stuckley about things that he's going to be able to do on time to ensure that the election is cleanly run. Can I ask you firstly, Mr. Stuckley, how are you monitoring the use of council assets and council resources by people who want to use them for electioneering purposes?
So it's Mr. Tuckley, but
I beg your
that's
pardon.
all right. Doesn't it?
I beg your pardon.
That's not the issue. It's what I do rather than what I'm called.
Yes,
that's
of course.
important, isn't it?
Forgive me.
So the council staff are given very clear guidance on what they should do and what's appropriate, not only during the pre-election period, the PERDA period, but more generally. But of course, as we approach the election, it's clear that at times some of those boundaries in terms of what candidates or potential candidates do and how they attempt to represent themselves to the public sometimes stray into areas that are unwise. So a number of the allegations that I have received are to do with the use of council resources, whether things like council email addresses or council telephone numbers or council services appearing on social media in the background to pictures of candidates. In those sorts of cases, we are very clear through the monitoring officer and through my law teams that is inappropriate and that should stop.
Taken any action against anybody?
We've pointed out in those cases that things are wrong, and where appropriate, we'll be taking that to the Standards Committee.
And you'll be doing that before May, will you?
Yes.
Can I ask you about, if you like, the hijacking of council resources for electioneering? I have in front of me a photograph which was taken last week of a council candidate clearly using council equipment to clean a path. This particular candidate, I see no reason why I shouldn't name him, he is one Abdul Allah, who says he thanks, in effect, Tower Hamlets for helping to keep Wapping clean and safe. And there is a picture of this man on a social media, as I say, using equipment. Clearly behind him is a Tower Hamlets vehicle. What action will you take against that? Are you familiar?
So I think that's one of the allegations that's been reported to us that is being investigated. Now, clearly, you just had a discussion about who is or isn't a candidate. Formally speaking, he presumably isn't a candidate because there's a formal nomination process. But I think the impression that you provide is clear. That's being investigated.
It's interesting you say that it's not clear. But
I said it is clear. I said the impression that you've given and the impression that the candidate, the prospective candidate, appears to be purporting to represent, that's the case is there. So there's a case to investigate and to take action on if appropriate.
Forgive me, it does sound a bit weak to take action as appropriate. And I might report it to the monitoring officer and I might give him words of advice. Given that the spotlight of the London elections is going to be on Tower Hamlets, and this of course applies to all of you, who will be looking at matters which are likely to affect the election in Tower Hamlets, because you know that you're going to be under the microscope. Don't you think that's rather a sort of weak response? Or ought you not to be saying since we have been told that this is a partnership with police, I think we've heard this several times, partnership with police, that, and it's certainly my experience as someone who's been involved in elections over many years, a fear or a belief that one's conduct is likely to be such that it might be reported to the police or the Electoral Commission or something like that is more than the kind of token slap on the wrist which you appear to be offering.
No, this has been reported to the police.
It
All,
has.
yes,
Thank you.
All the allegations.
That's
As was outlined earlier, there is close working between the police and the council. All the allegations that the council receives are included in the allegations which go to the police. And therefore appropriate action is taken.
Well, thank you for that, Mr. Tuckley. That is a substantial response. Can I therefore ask the police, can I ask you, Ms Williams, will you be investigating this matter and looking into it before the election?
So if this is one of the RPA offences, it's under Stuart's remit.
All right.
And Stuart, as has said, well, I'll let you speak for yourself, but they're all being investigated. My team locally will deal with the crimes that are not RPA type offences, and I've got a separate team that is looking at all of those. Okay. And there's only a few of those because we had to set a criteria. So for us, so I'm diverting from your question, but for us, our criteria would be it has to be not an RPA offence, reported from January 2018, and has some sort of electoral connection, be it that it involves an MP, councillor, candidate, or is perceived to be related to the elections or has a raising community tensions. So it could be like a hate crime. But they're the ones we're dealing with.
I understand this. My preamble for all of this was to do with timeliness. Mr Ryan, will this matter be looked into before the election?
Yeah, it's been looked at the moment.
Okay.
And just to give you a bit of reassurance around the timescales and things like that, all the investigations that we get, monthly, the outcomes and the status of those investigations will be shared with the Electoral Commission, with the Council anyway. We've got a scanning document that we work with Tower Hamlets to give a idea of how many allegations are coming in, what the outcomes are going to be looking like, etc. But on top of that, we're looking at a local reassurance group to actually challenge us around the investigations, to actually turn around to us and say what's going on with those, so that there is sort of independent pressure, rather than just we'll get back to you. There's actually grip around what are you actually doing about those investigations. And I'm more than happy in terms of members to be sharing with you on a monthly basis as we move into this election piece how many allegations we've had and what the outcomes have been, whether it's been closed and why it's been closed, or if it's open, what's being done with it. I'm more than happy to share that information.
To do that would be helpful.
Right. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay. Thank you. Right, let's moving on now to, there was issues clearly around the electoral register, false registration, and issues around postal votes. Caroline, you've got some questions around that.
Absolutely. Let's start with how accurate the electoral register is. So perhaps to Mr Tuckley, what are you doing to ensure that your electoral register is accurate? And you did say earlier you've got 190,000 on the register now, which is the largest it's ever been.
That's right, and of course, so I'm, as well as being the returning officer, I'm also the electoral registration officer, and that means that one of my obligations is to try and ensure that everybody who is entitled to register is on the register. So we have a pretty extensive and detailed process of trying to make sure the register is as up to date and accurate as possible, and that includes a detailed electoral canvass, which we've just completed, and that involves the publication of a new register on an annual basis. We send a household notification letter prior to every election, so in the next few days those will go out to every household. One of the things we do particularly, and it's been noted in one or two occasions in the exchanges so far, is that we visit every address that has 5 or more people registered. So they're canvassed in person directly to check that these circumstances are as we have. We do a whole set of data matching exercises, again, to try and ensure that the register is accurate. So we do that against the council tax register to ensure that the residences are compatible and that we remove previous electors who've moved. We have a weekly process where our council tax team provide details to our electoral registration team of changes in the council tax register. One of the things we do as we approach the election is, as in other places, we issue poll cards. In our case, we issue them for empty properties as well as properties where there are registered people, to alert people to the question that they won't be registered in that address. But in Tower Hamlets, again, differently from other places, those polling cards are posted in envelopes in order to try and get that polling card to the person who is individually registered. And as you know, we're now in the process of individual electoral registration rather than household registration. We do tell us once, so we get regular notifications of deaths and of new citizens reporting coming into the borough, and that means that information can be passed into the register. We do regular checks on things like single person discounts for council tax, again, which needs to be compatible with the data that we have on the electoral register. One of the key things in the run-up to recent elections has been duplicate registrations. The timing is now very tight between registration and the organisation of the election, with people being able to register later than was previously the case. What happens when there is national communication and information about elections and knowledge rises is people re-register often because they're not entirely sure whether they are on the register or what the precise arrangements are. We had one of the highest levels of duplicate registration in the country. And that causes us intense work because we have to go through and check to make sure absolutely precisely that the duplicate is a genuine duplicate, but we do that very assiduously. We have whole GIS mapping systems of properties in the borough. As I mentioned earlier, we've had the highest level of population growth and the highest numbers of new properties built in the borough. Therefore, we have to keep real track of the nature of our population and the nature of the area in terms of homes and where people are likely to live. So keeping track of that is a key thing for our planners and the people who name roads, and we have to link that to the register and make sure that that is absolutely precise. We do registration drives. I myself have done a number of those, particularly in student accommodation in the borough that we have quite a lot of. We do it through local libraries, through our idea stores, intending to make sure that those people who are eligible to vote are on the registers. And of course, we send the published registers to political parties and to elected members to try and ensure that, again, the published register is available and people can check to see whether there are any anomalies on the register itself. So it's quite an extensive process to try and make sure it's right. It's the basis of our democracy. It has to be as accurate as we can make it.
Thank you for that. It's very comprehensive. Let me just unpack a bit the issue that you go to every address where there's 5 or more registered. I can see when you've done your annual big canvas that you would have that. But if people then add one person on here, one person on there, and it's sort of done drip throughout the year, are you then looking and saying, hang on, we've got 5 or more at that, we need to go and check this out? So that is constant, it's not just the big canvas.
Constant. No, it's constant. One of the things used to be that, so I've got a team of 10 people, core team of 10 people as my elections team. And it used to be that you could use all 10 of those certain parts of the year for registration and in certain parts of the year to organise an electoral event, a referendum or an election. Actually, under the new arrangements under IER, registration is a constant process. So I have split my team in 2, and I have a team that spend all of their time, bar perhaps election day itself, on registration.
Okay. And in terms of, say you've got a house that's broken up, you know, people break it up into bedsits and whatever, and you had 4 in each of those registered at each of the individual addresses, but actually really it's one house, would that flag an alarm with you because it's just below your 5 per address and think, hang on, something's going on there?
It would, and of course I talked about some of the connections we try and make. So common with other boroughs, we now have a variety of licensing schemes for HMOs, houses of multiple occupation, and indeed in some particular circumstances for private landlords generally. So we can do and do some cross-tabulation to try and work out where are likely to be those areas of most risk.
You're doing that. Can you clarify the point you were saying about polling cards going in envelopes? Great, but to empty properties, can you just clarify what you meant by that?
So we need to make sure that people who perhaps have recently moved into the borough and haven't registered, that they don't think that they've registered. So they get a polling card which is clear that it's in respect of that empty property, to check that the people in that property can then contact us and register because there will still be time.
Right, so you send out a poll card, which really is a flyer saying, we don't have anyone registered to vote here. If you are living here, this is how you can. Right, okay, so it's more of a notification rather than it's an actual poll card. Okay, okay, that's helpful. And the duplicate registrations, so that you have the highest level.
Amongst the highest levels, I'm not quite sure whether it was the highest level, but it's pretty high.
Up there. Somebody sends you a form, you look and they're already on the register, you check that it isn't another person there, father, son, whatever. And then if you realise it is the same person, you don't have to put that one on the register, you're able to. Okay.
Right, the complication is that, of course, now, and it's a good thing, people can register online. But of course, beneath the online registration is quite a complex and appropriately complex administrative process. But it's very easy, and it's designed to be very easy for somebody to register, to put their name in, and then if they have it, their national insurance number, but we have to follow that up to ascertain the details and then do the match to see whether that person's a duplicate or not.
Obviously, in the election court, it showed that there have been false registration of people's names at different properties, and people have registered twice at different properties or other things. What other work are you doing, dip sampling and the like, to try to make sure that you're not having people falsely register to vote?
It's really, so that description that I gave of the respective checks and balances, all of those things are designed to try and identify where that's likely to occur. Of course, we also receive regular intelligence, as we talked about earlier, and we therefore have a process of following up on any information that we receive to check whether the registration that we've got is accurate and appropriate.
And linked to this, obviously I realise we don't have any formal nominations of candidates yet, but there was open criticism from last time about false addresses were used, so people were known to not even live in the borough and they were registering a business address as a home address and so on. What checks are you going to be doing on that, given you've done so much work on your electoral register, to make sure people who are standing genuinely have a right to stand?
So I think the rules in terms of nominations are pretty clear. What circumstances people have to have in order to be eligible to be nominated. What I need to be very clear of is in my briefing to political parties in particular what those rules are, because the responsibility is actually on the parties to come forward with appropriate information and to abide by the rules that apply in those circumstances. So that's the position.
So you're going to be keeping a close eye on that.
So I keep a close eye on it, but it isn't the returning officer's responsibility. Claire may have more to say about this, to investigate in detail the circumstances that sit behind each candidate. The parties need to make sure that the information that they provide is accurate and appropriate in terms of the circumstances of the nominee. I don't have, and it's probably not appropriate for me to have, an extensive checking process around each candidate.
Surely if somebody's putting down an address as where they live and it's known to be actually a unit on an industrial estate or a business, that surely would flag an alarm bell and you check. It would
flag an alarm bell, and I build into the processes that I adopt locally plenty of time for those things to be identified. I just wanted to be very clear that it isn't my responsibility to verify the information that comes from the individual. It's the individual's responsibility to make sure that is right.
And in terms of postal votes in Tower Hamlets, obviously in the election court judgment, examples were given where postal votes were handed over for someone else to complete, lots of examples of things filled in the same hand, same ink and so on. What additional checks are you doing on postal votes in Tower Hamlets?
So, we're going to be doing the pilot with the Cabinet Office, testing additional measures in relation to the integrity of the postal vote process. It's, I think, important to emphasise these are additional to all the measures that are currently in place in relation to postal votes. So I think members will know that in terms of the postal vote process, there is a really intense exercise that checks the signatures of postal votes that return, checks the dates of birth, and in essence rejects quite a significant proportion of postal votes on that basis. So there is already a pretty robust, what I would regard as pretty robust system in terms of those postal votes that come back to try and verify that that the signatures, the dates of birth are precisely correct. In Tower Hamlets, that process has generally led to something between 3 and 6% of postal votes that are returned that are rejected at that point. In addition, what we will be doing to all the other measures that I've described in terms of the postal vote pilot with the Cabinet Office, we'll be doing 3 things, one of which echoes the point that Claire made at the beginning. So we have redesigned the warning information that goes into our postal vote packs. We have about 35,000 postal vote packs that we send out in Tower Hamlets. Each one of those will receive a carefully redrafted set of information that makes it very clear how people should handle their postal votes, and that only they should handle it, and it's their vote and they need to use it, and it should not be interfered with by anybody else. We will then be doing 2 other things. So we will be selecting on the basis of our electoral management system. So there will be a random sample of those people who receive postal votes who will receive a follow-up from the council, which on behalf of me, that will check that those people who where the postal votes have been distributed and delivered, check that they've received them. And we will be able to, if they have not received them, we will be able to cancel the postal votes that have been issued and reissue them. Secondly, there will be a similar process that then applies once the postal votes have been returned. And that process will check that the elector has returned their postal vote, that it was not interfered with by anybody else, that it was not influenced inappropriately by anybody else, and the postal vote we have back is the postal vote that they posted and provided back to us. Very keen to be part of that process in order to test how we can make the postal vote, which of course, as you all know, the number of postal votes has been increasing step by step by step. Try and make that process as watertight as it can be. In addition, in Tower Hamlets, we've been trying to put in place additional controls in relation to, for example, postal votes that are handed in at polling stations. So making sure that we take a note of what's returned and by who. So that again, there's a mechanism to check back, and so we have more information in case there is any malpractice taking place in that regard. And of course, the handling of postal votes by political parties was something which was made very clear that was inappropriate in the protocol that we again talked about earlier in terms of the questions about the agreement between political parties and the returning officer.
Just to check, and on that extra check you're doing on polling day itself, those votes you then absolutely check the signatures and so on to make sure that it is accurate, that it is the person who's voted.
So 100% of postal votes that are returned, the signatures and the dates of birth are all checked.
Good, okay. And just to clarify, there's two other bits of follow-up. One is, have you received your postal vote? And one is, did you return it? How are you following that up? Is that just another letter, or is that a phone call? Or
Our intention is to do a phone call.
Because that's good, because I was thinking that actually if you do a mail out, if post is being interfered with, that's not going to work.
Yes.
So your intention is to do a phone call. Is it? Yeah. Okay. I think that's really interesting to hear those additional measures you're putting in place. Claire, can I come to you? Is there anything else you think Tower Hamlets should be doing to try to prevent some of these problems we've had with postal votes and harvesting, I think is the verb that's used?
I mean, I think just set out really clearly the whole range of things we're doing, and we really welcome their involvement in the postal vote pilot, and we'll be conducting the evaluation of that. So, the effectiveness of those measures will be captured through that, which again I think will help learning more broadly. And I think a lot of the measures they're doing are things that we would very much like to see. And so, that example of the handling of postal votes by campaigners, that is a recommendation in Pickles. There are some challenges around how you define a campaigner, but essentially we would support those changes as well. So, from our point of view, I think there's some really good things going on which will help build on the argument for wider, more systemic change. We're monitoring and working with them on the planning of this, and very pleased with what we're seeing there so far.
So you're confident that the measures that Mr Tuckley has outlined in detail this morning are going to stop the voter fraud we saw back in 2014?
I think it's very difficult to say it would stop all voter fraud. And I think one of the challenges we face here is actually capturing the extent to which it's really happening. And I think what these changes and actions are really sensible things that need to be done in order to improve that dramatically, and also help us actually understand that awareness better. I think particularly some of the elements of the pilot and the follow-ups will hopefully through the evaluation we can see give real shine a bright light on areas where it is otherwise quite difficult. So I think we're pleased with what we're seeing, as we say. Unfortunately I don't think we can ever rule that out. I think just to add, though, the other element that I think is an issue for all of us isn't just what's actually happening, but the public perception and the concern that causes. And I think, the fact that the pilot's taking place, that these actions are happening, people will see those things going on. We will be doing some additional campaign activity, particularly around Your Vote, Yours Alone, which will be a national campaign, but for use locally and quite specifically about really trying to get that message out. That will be published in multiple languages so that we can really get it into communities where we've perhaps struggled to get that message in the past. So I think combined with that ability and the increased communication openness from the police and the transparency there, which we're really pleased to see, I think should help with that perception challenge as well as the actual challenge.
And is there anything else, as Chief Executive, how much you think you should be doing, you'd like to be doing if resources allowed? And are you confident that what you've put in place is going to prevent the fraud on the scale that we saw last time?
I suppose I'm in the fortunate position, because I am the Chief Executive as well as the returning officer, that I can ensure that the Council as a whole assists in the electoral process. The Council has a responsibility, all councils have a responsibility to assist their returning officers. As you know, in 2014, the returning officer wasn't the chief executive of the council. I think the commissioners and indeed the mayor, Tower Hamlets, were very keen, and indeed members in Tower Hamlets were very keen that when they appointed a new chief executive, that person was also the returning officer. Obviously, the mayoral and local elections, as opposed to other elections, are funded they're funded locally. So in that sense, there's a different regime that applies in relation to ensuring that the resources are in place. I am in a position to make sure that, notwithstanding austerity and the pressures on local government funding and the reductions that Tower Hamlets has experienced, I am in a position to make sure that we have the resources that we need. They're clearly not going to be excessive, but so that I suppose people know, it's likely that I'll employ personally more than 800 people to conduct elements of the election, and that's obviously separate from the resources that the police that Sue outlined earlier. It's a big undertaking. There's considerable expense, but democracy is really important, and the integrity of democracy is really important. Can I guarantee that there is no fraudulent or corrupt activity? I think, as Claire just said, I think it's impossible for me to do that. What I can do is, as I said right at the beginning, is to do everything that's conceivable to learn the lessons from 2014, to learn the lessons of the 4 or 5 electoral processes that I've been responsible for in Tower Hamlets since, and to build on my, I think I worked out the other day, 21 years experience of being involved in and running elections. It's probably less than some of you, mind you, but it's still considerable.
It is actually. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes, we could tell a tale about that. Anyway, Susan, you wanted to...
Yes, please. One very, very quick one. With the postal vote sampling, if you do some sampling and get some really bad results back with discrepancies, etc., will you go back to look at yet more, or will you just say, well, there's lots of discrepancies? What action will you take if you find that the samples show up irregularities?
So I think you're right, and one of the things that we're planning for is, so what action will we take depending on what the sampling reveals. So clearly we can take action in relation to individual cases where somebody hasn't received their postal vote and we sent it out. So as I said, we can cancel that, we can make arrangements for them to receive a new postal vote. If it shows systematic, something that could be systematic, so an area, say, that for some reason in that area the postal votes haven't got through, then you're absolutely right. I need to then follow that up with colleagues in the police and take action, both in terms of ensuring that people can exercise their democratic rights, but also looking to see what might have happened in terms of those votes, those packs not reaching the people who they intended to reach.
So what level, at which point will you be alarmed? At a percentage, or just a feeling? Or?
Well, I think any that don't reach anybody is alarming. That's
an ideal answer. So any that don't reach there, you're going to flag it up straight away.
Well, because I need to take action. Because
we're really happy about that. That's good news.
Yes.
Lovely, thank you.
Right, the last 2 sets of questions is around discrepancies and allegations outside and inside polling stations, particularly on the outside. This was harassment of voters and other issues around that. Ulmesh, I think you're leading on
Yes,
this.
thank you, Chair. If I could ask you, Will, now these are some of the realities on the day itself, or potential situations that could arise. So we've had many allegations, and not just allegations, but people who actually seen what goes on in terms of voter intimidation in and around polling stations or in the approach area to polling stations. So in Tower Hamlets, in the past, space has been provided for electors to enter the polling station without being subjected to being harangued by activists. Will you be setting this up again for the May elections?
So yes, we will. So again, for members who may not have seen it, we have, in essence, a sort of a zone around the entrance to polling stations that is marked out with that characteristic yellow and black tape. And that's an area in which, with the assistance of the police officer, we are very clear that only voters who are going through into the polling station should be. And those zones, we've employed them in all the elections that I've been responsible for, and they've been observed extremely well. They're not statutory, but I think they were recommended by the Pickles report. They have been seen by many other authorities and by the Electoral Commission as good practice. And because in Tower Hamlets we do have police officers at every polling station, which I don't think anybody else has, we are in a really strong position to be able to enforce those arrangements. In addition, clearly, and Sue described in some detail the training of police officers, clearly we go through an extensive training process for our presiding officers and our poll clerks. And I am generally pretty careful making sure that we have at least the minimum level recommended by the Electoral Commission, and often a higher level of staffing in the polling stations, and that those staff are very clear about what behaviour should be like in the station itself, and that they are ready to intervene at any point should that behaviour not be appropriate. And having very active presiding officers is it's been part of the process of moving Tower Hamlets' sort of electoral operation forward. So those presiding officers are trained to intervene, if the language being spoken in the polling station is not English, to intervene if more than one person looks like they're heading for a polling booth. We've introduced sort of extra sides on the polling booth to try and emphasise the fact that it's an individual's responsibility or right to exercise their vote, not a collective process. So I think we've got a whole variety of measures in place which seek to retain the sanctity of the polling station.
Thank you for that answer, Will. I think the next set of questions is about what goes on inside the polling station. If I could just ask you, Sue and Stuart, for your observations. This week, the Prime Minister announced that the government will consult on plans for a new offence for intimidation in public life, aimed at protecting candidates and campaigners. What are your thoughts on these proposals? I mean, they're too late, obviously, for the May elections, but
I don't think I've seen that. So that was
speech yesterday.
Oh, was it in the speech yesterday? I'm terribly sorry, but I've missed that one.
I saw it on social media 2 days ago, but I think the speech was yesterday.
I mean,
do you want?
It might be. I mean, it was trailed, and then it was the speech was trailed, and then it was the substantial of it was in the Prime Minister's speech yesterday. I think that. It is about looking at the offences, so asking the Law Commission to have a look at the offences around intimidation of candidates, and I think we would all welcome that, and there's also some broader issues about social media and the use of that and bullying on social media. I think we, and I suspect the police and the MPCC will be actively feeding into the Law Commission's review. I referenced them earlier in terms of broader electoral reform law change. They've been extremely useful, the work they've done there, and that's something that I suspect we'll all be wanting to feed into.
Just two more questions. Just going back to what goes on outside polling stations. So, Will, I mean, again, I know this can't be enforced, but as part of the code of conduct in some boroughs, parties have been asked to agree to having a minimum number of or a maximum number of campaigners outside a polling station, 2 or 3. Would that be something that you would consider?
I was just checking the original protocol. I think it was part of the original. So activity at polling places restricted to 2 campaigners per polling place, with a vice, re-intimidation or undue influence, and which was endorsed by the police. That was in place for the 2014 elections. I think that's a sensible type of agreement. As you say, the issue is about whether you can enforce it.
Absolutely.
So I think Sue mentioned earlier that the Met will have some backup resource. One of the things I've done is strengthened my polling station inspectors regime. So I now have more people who are there really to assist presiding officers. So presiding officers learn from voters that there is some pressure being exerted outside the station. I have got some resource which I can call on in conjunction with the Met to seek to address that. Of course, it depends on the scale and the type of intimidation that's taking place. But I can get reports and I can take some resource into trying to disperse that and take action. And of course, I can contact the relevant party.
Just taking a practical situation, sir. So, say if there are crowds that seem to be trying to prevent voters outside a polling station, or to pressurize voters outside a polling station, what would you expect the officers to do in a situation like that? I mean, in Tower Hamlets in 2014 and other elections, we've had groups of up to 30, 40, 50 people at certain polling stations, particularly in the northern part of the borough.
So that's been part of the briefing of the officers. If they're learning from the past that there have been quite a lot of people outside either canvassing or intimidating. So as we said, we've got officers in every polling station, but we've gone back and looked at the high-risk polling stations where we're putting additional officers there to assist. We do have patrols in the area, so as soon as an officer sees that there may be an issue, they can call up through their sergeant for those additional patrols to be allocated to that particular area if we think we've got a crowd gathering and we're not quite sure what their intentions are. We'll send officers down there to have a look so that we can prevent any intimidation of voters. We do have officers from the SEC team who are going to be out and about. We have officers from other units that are working with us that will also be out and about. And as I've said, we've got some Bangladesh officers who will also be posted around the area so that they will help us. So there's quite a lot of resources that are being put into that. And just, to reassure you on some of our planning, we've asked the ACC CAN, who is the National Police Lead on elections, to review our plans and what we've been doing. And he's held us up as good practice, as well as the HMIC, who we've asked to come in and have a look at what we're doing and where we've got our resources. And they've also, and I think they've even commented on it in one of their previous documents, that they also hold us up as good practice. So that will be learning for the Met as a whole around some of the things that we're doing.
Thank you. Andrew?
Well, just a short one to reassure myself. So if these gangs of 20, 30, 40 people do appear in the vicinity of a polling station, obviously outside Will's cordon sanitaire, do you have sufficient powers to disperse them?
Yes, of course we do. So, I mean, officers have, under the Public Order Act, of course they've got those sort of powers. If there are offences apparent, then they can deal with them for offences. They will have their body-worn camera, and I think that is such a great tool, because the minute they turn it on and people know they're being filmed and we know who they are, what they look like, what they're wearing, we can track them. So we can track to see if they turn up. So we've also got an officer that will be at the CCTV control room at local authority. So if we see something happening somewhere and we've dispersed them, that officer within the CCTV will look to see whether that crowd or those people start making their way to another venue. And then we can direct our resources to deal with them accordingly, depending on what offences there are.
We've got over 300 cameras, so it's a place with quite a lot of vigilance.
But you do have power to disperse a crowd?
Yes.
Powers there, but that's reassuring. Right, the last set of questions, we have touched upon these, is around the activities inside the polling stations and count centres. Tony?
Mr. Tuckley, can you tell us what forms of identification will be needed, if any, when people turn up to vote?
So people won't need forms of identification, but they will be challenged to provide their name and address. And they will need to provide that, not hand over their poll card. They need to provide that to the poll clerk so that they can be correctly identified.
That's nothing different from what has always happened.
That's right.
Okay. Can I ask you, Ms. Bassett, pilots were supposed to be introduced whereby there should have been voter identification. Can you tell us why Tower Hamlets was not a pilot?
I just need to be really clear that we're not responsible for the pilots. The pilots are a Cabinet Office initiative.
Yes.
We have provided advice, but they have been very much Cabinet Office led. It's been the Cabinet Office who has sought to engage different local authorities in those pilots. Our role is to evaluate them. There are 5 pilots to do with ID. They are in the process of being developed as we speak, and the orders go through. I think there's 1 order outstanding. It has been a fairly short time frame in which they have been set up for these elections, and that's why there are essentially only 5. But we haven't had any input into who's in them or what form they take. I would say we really support voter ID in polling stations, though.
Yes, I'm sure you do. When the idea was floated, it presumably would have been some discussion, even though the decision was not yours. It's hard to imagine there wasn't discussion with the Commission. As to these pilots, are you able to say whether or not you suggested to the Cabinet Office that Tower Hamlets ought to be one of the places where this scheme should be piloted?
So there wasn't a discussion.
Not at all.
What happened was the Cabinet Office went out to local authorities and invited applications to be part of the pilot. That there was a fairly lengthy period where sort of the idea was worked up, and certainly within that there was discussion had about, for example, the 17 local authorities deemed to be high risk were looked at, and also what comparator would be helpful and what methodology. But just to be clear, we had very little input into that, and the actual process between deciding to open up to local authorities for bids to be part of the pilots and the closing of that deadline was extremely short. I think it was a matter of just a few weeks, and we did not have an input into who actually that went forward with.
Would it be helpful if I clarify Tower Hamlets' position in relation to this? So, the work that was done on following up the 2014 and 2015 elections in Tower Hamlets, the work that was done by the returning officer, indicated that voter ID was something that we were interested in. When the pilots were announced and the expression of interest was requested, at that point, Tower Hamlets was interested and indeed continues to be interested, and I, as the returning officer, continue to be interested in voter ID in principle. So I did put in an expression of interest, having discussed it with colleagues in Tower Hamlets and also with the DCLG commissioners who were in place at that time. However, I was very clear that this is a major change in voting practice. And if we're going to be in a position where if somebody does not turn up with their ID, that they are sent away and prospectively lose their entitlement to vote as a consequence, we have to have a thoroughly thought through, properly planned and properly executed and communicated plan to make that change. And I was very clear that I needed to know by last June that that's what we were going to be a pilot and the form in which that was going to go forward. And I made that position very clear in public and to the appropriate minister. I actually had an opportunity to speak to the minister and made that position clear. Now, for various reasons, other things intervened. I think there was a general election. And it was not possible for the Cabinet Office to confirm the ID pilots in the timescale that I needed in order to make sure that I could run a proper, effective election locally. The risks, when I was not in a position to be able to confirm that by June, were just too great. And indeed, the pilot's still in the process of being designed. We're at the final stages. The electoral process is a really important process. I am personally in a position where I could be the subject of an election petition. I have duties to make sure that the election is accessible and that people can vote. I also have duties to make sure that the process has integrity. And in the circumstances, I came to the conclusion that where we were in terms of the details of the voter ID pilot, that was too big a risk. But I remain committed to the principle. We've remained supportive of the Cabinet Officer's endeavours in this regard. I designed a system based on our electoral management system that minimised the prospect of voter ID producing queues in polling stations. But actually, once the general election had taken place, once the winning party had a manifesto commitment that said that there would be a national system, the model that I had designed for Tower Hamlets would never be that national system, because everybody has a different electoral management system. Therefore, the type of pilot that I was planning to do could not be a pilot, because it couldn't test something that couldn't happen on a national basis. So for all those reasons, I couldn't honestly say that the best thing for me to take forward was the voter ID pilot. However, I was very interested in piloting improvements to the electoral process, hence the postal vote pilot that we talked about earlier.
Well, of course, we're all... the reason why this hearing is being held and this whole matter has arisen relates to the integrity of the voting system in Tower Hamlets. I think you've just expressed your worry that some people might turn up to the polling station, be unable to give proof of identity and therefore be deprived of their vote. Do you not think that all the things that you have described to us today that you're going to bring in relation to postal voting and letters and telephone calls and all the rest of it to ensure that there is that integrity, that would not have been sufficient to ensure that when a person turned up to vote, they would have with them some form of identity? Perhaps that's a rhetorical question.
Well, I think it may be a rhetorical question, but no, I'm not, because I think the churn in the population of Tower Hamlets and the change, and sometimes it never ceases to surprise me how low level of understanding about electoral processes and democracy is. So I thought there was a real risk that people would turn up without their ID through, not because they didn't have any or because they were attempting fraudulently to vote, but because they didn't know. And what I couldn't risk was chaos spread across Tower Hamlets in 2018. I didn't think that that was in my interest or indeed the voters' interest.
I understand that, but that's tantamount to suggesting it in a sort of way that people who turn up to vote have no idea why they've turned up in the first place. I mean, that's the corollary of what you're saying. We have heard, Mr. Tuckley, I think that your phrase was that it will be predominantly English spoken in the polling station, and I think we have heard from the police that they will have people, Bangladeshi officers, who can speak the first language of many of the voters. Do you not think it appropriate that only English, Mr. Tuckley, should be spoken in the polling station?
Yes, and that's indeed the arrangements that we have, and we have notices and training to that extent. So my predominantly was only the fact that some people attempt to, some people may not abide by that, and what I was saying, I think, is that the role of the presiding officer and the poll clerks is to intervene and say, sorry, only English is spoken in the polling station.
Okay. So that's going to happen.
Yes.
And finally, I think all the other set questions that I've been given have been asked. But I do want to ask you about the allegedly unique counting which goes on in Tower Hamlets elections. We have been told that what happens is that votes at counting places are entered onto pieces of paper and then into a computer rather than being stacked up according to candidate. Firstly, did that happen? And secondly, is it going to happen?
So I think it's really important, and Councillor Golds and others I've discussed this with, I think it's really important that democracy is seen to happen as well as does happen. So I'm going to do everything I can to ensure that there are, in the centre of the counting arena, that there are piles of votes that people can see mounting up in relation to the however many mayoral candidates that we have, and that the process that we adopt for the count is as visible as is possible by those people who are there to observe that the right and proper processes are happening. We've had comments on each of the counts previously, and indeed of those that I've been responsible for, and we will take all of that into account and produce a plan for the count, which we will publish, which hopefully will be another step in the direction of being transparent about the process that we're going to adopt.
So what's going to happen at your count in May is going to be no different. I'm talking about the actual process. Is going to be no different from what's going to happen anywhere else in London.
That sort of presupposes that all those counts are the same. They've all got individual elements. I hope we will have the best practice of all of those counts. That will be my intention.
Thank you, Chairman.
I'll answer that. Caroline, last question, I think.
So I've not known different counts. They pile up the votes and then you go count through the split ones on, tallying them up on a chart. I mean, that seems very strange if it's hidden and given the reputation.
So it isn't hidden, but there are slightly differing methodologies that are adopted in terms of, so people who've, I call on others, if people have stood in different locations, you will see returning officers adopt slightly different methodologies, not, the fundamentals should be the same. But, sorry, I didn't,
we got that. All right.
What I wanted to pick up is the, you said earlier something about you're going to be recruiting about 800 staff. Does this mean that the people who are going to be doing the counting are going to be, for example, bank clerks and the like that you see in some places, rather than council staff or others?
There will be a mixture. I'm afraid. I think the days when we used to employ bank clerks are probably gone. Not that we don't want to, but there aren't.
Used to enjoy it enormously.
There's a recruitment process. There are lots of checks and balances in that recruitment process. The issue is, of course, that every election is different. Every election is a one-off event, and everybody is recruited for that one-off event by the returning officer. So we have a process that is designed to do that. What we've done is built in extra checks and balances. Of course, people have to sign up to observing all the appropriate rules of a proper election process. But also, we've taken the additional step since 2014 of being absolutely clear that nobody can work on a polling station in the area where they live, the ward that they live, and nobody is allowed to move seat in the count venue. So I have always had the practice, but I gather this may not have always been the case, of being absolutely clear that the returning officer and my staff allocate counters to a specific seat, and that those counters should have nothing to do with the ward that they're counting. And there is no discretion on anybody's part to move themselves around the count venue or to exercise any discretion on which part of the count they may or may not be involved in.
Just questioning, I accept bank clerks aren't always used these days, but I was just saying, given you'd had lots of questions about the count itself, maybe having some completely independent people in.
No, there are.
Will help with the reputation of your
absolutely.
count.
No, there are. We recruit on an open basis, but some of those may be council staff, some of them will be wide. Yeah.
Okay.
Andrew briefly.
Are you counting on Thursday night or on Friday morning?
So we're doing the verification. So the first stage of the Tower Hamlets Mayoral and the Tower Hamlets local elections through Thursday night into the early hours of Friday morning. And that's obviously, as you know, to avoid, to make sure that ballot papers that have gone in the wrong box, we can make sure that we've got the right number of ballot papers for each election. Then we will be doing the Tower Hamlets mayoral count, following on from doing the verification. Then at the conclusion of that count, that team will be stood down and will be going home. And then a new team will come forward after a period to do the local ward count for Tower Hamlets. All of that will take place in one of the large exhibition hangars at Excel.
It's going to be one continuous process.
No, there's a break in the middle. So there's a break between the end of the Tower Hamlets mayoral count, declaration, dispersed, goes home, come back to do the ward count. There will also be a break between the verification and the mayoral count, because many of the people who will be there observing the verification, because they are candidates or associated with the ward count, are not entitled to be there for the count for the mayoral election.
So that will reduce the crowding.
It will reduce the crowding, but of course it does mean that there are a lot of people there for the verification process. And getting the verification right is an important key part of getting the overall count right.
We've got different coloured ballot papers.
Yes.
Okay, I've got one last brief question really for Claire and Will. This is a kind of wrap question to the degree that if anybody out there in Tower Hamlets from now on in, other than people look at it very closely, do sense an issue, they're worried about electoral fraud, that something doesn't feel right to them, and they're not quite sure where to go, where will they go, where will they see that, where will they be directed?
So if they come into us, we have a public inquiry line, which would note that. We would refer them to the police and refer the matter ourselves to the police if we thought that was appropriate. The other thing just to mention is Crime Stoppers. We've had a partnership with them since 2015, and there is the anonymous reporting there, which would really encourage people to use if they're concerned.
So we have had and continue to have a inquiry line, a special election inquiry line that we make sure that we respond to in 24 hours. As Sue mentioned earlier, we've now got on the web pages, we have now a combined reporting place. That means that anybody can report any incident or issue, and that will automatically be reported simultaneously to the to me in the council, to both Sue and to the set team and to the Electoral Commission. But so there should be plenty of opportunities for people to report things. But of course, I can also be reached directly if there is any need for that to occur. So because we are all very sensitive that we need to make sure that we maximise the confidence in the process.
On that, Ulmish.
Sorry, two questions, Chair, to you, Will. Are there any circumstances in which you would allow someone to accompany an elector into the polling station?
People can come into the polling station. I think the issue is the polling
Being accompanied
booth.
by someone. Yeah, well,
So I think there are certain circumstances in relation to disability where that might be appropriate. And I know we have particular arrangements for people who have seeing problems, issues in relation to sight, and arrangements to try and support those voters. But it is in very particular circumstances.
I thought that would answer.
Yeah.
Now, I totally agree with the point made by my colleague Tony Arbor about only English being spoken inside the polling station. Yes. But presumably there will be counting polling station staff who could interpret if need be.
There are, but their role is to listen, not to pick things up, not to engage then in dialogue.
No, I'm going very specifically to issues that were brought to my attention as to what happened in 2014, where people accompanied electors into the polling station, ostensibly acting as interpreters, and were allowed to get away with it. I say, I had 2 examples brought to my attention, so I don't make a mountain of a molehill. But if someone does need help with the process and so on, there will be staff available.
There will be staff available, yes.
What I'm saying is you don't want anyone from outside coming in as an interpreter.
Absolutely,
and
that's the appropriate step for people to take.
Secondly, again, speaking to one of the successful candidates from 2014, this was the immediate aftermath of 2014, he was extremely bitter about the way some of the staff were operating and the whole integrity of the process. Now, you've given us a very comprehensive answer as to how you're doing the recruitment and so on, 800 staff being trained. But given the seriousness of the allegations that were made about the way some staff operated in 2014, will you be checking, and I know this is an onerous task, or asking the 800 people that you intend to appoint whether they are related to any of the candidates in the election?
That will be...
And it's a difficult process, Will.
No, it is a difficult process, but any of that type of interest is clearly relevant, and we will want to look at that very carefully.
Yeah, good. There could be a declaration.
Exactly.
You could sign something. Possibly.
Yeah, no, that's part of that
I know
process.
the commissioners have made some recommendations, but in the context of the East Stand and some of the very serious allegations made in 2014.
My staff visit polling stations, so we check what's happening there, and obviously, in terms of behaviour of staff at the count, there are very strict rules about what people, and there should be no exchange over the tables between the observers and the counting staff. That isn't their job to do that. If there's any conversation needed, it needs to be with more senior staff.
Okay. Thank you. Right, thank you. Well, thank you for that in-depth answers. There is a lot of reassurance coming across the table. Council, police, Claire. But Claire, we have an issue around the emblem, and an issue that has some urgency around it. We would ask you to go away and put that at the top of your pile of things to do, unless you're signalling.
Also, if the police could liaise with the CPS about that particular Twitter exchange. Those actions speak louder than words, and if there is a case for someone to be charged with an offence, only if there's a case, of course, I think that will send out a far stronger message than an investigation report by ourselves.
I think it's the immediacy that we're talking about here, and also, Stuart, you kindly offered, I think, to give us some briefings between then and now in the form that we can work between us about how it progresses, your conclusions in the next couple of months. I think you offered that up earlier, and I think that was helpful. So again, thank you very much for attending today. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion, but also ask the committee to delegate authority to be in consultation as to what actions we take after this meeting. Item 7, can I ask the committee to note the updated work programme? Our next meeting is on Wednesday the 21st of February, a Q&A. I have no other business. Thank you for attending this morning. Oh, by the way, Croydon is bigger than...
GLA, Chamber, Sound.